I don't know.
You got to do what you got to do.
Yeah.
Of course. So far, our conversation has been about this 38% or so that are on the other side of basic. But ultimately, if we take this position about the processing inefficiency that's developing the scripts, that plays across the basic and all the way up to this 68% or so in fourth grade that are below proficient.
Right.
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 So though we can say that this is a social screen that's got this very hard gate at the lower level, it's also affecting psychologically, academically, and in all these other ways our population to the extent that we could say most of our children, to some degree, are having their lives all but faded by how well they learn to read.
Absolutely. And if you look at that figure, that only a small percent of our kids are proficient in what it takes to read, understand, and generalize content information. That is clearly related to instruction. It's clearly related to a very parochial and, again, primarily philosophical view of what goes into reading and using reading to learn. Not only learning to read, but reading to learn. It goes back to what we were saying. Teachers at every level, even if they're content teachers, social studies, science, or math, must have a much deeper understanding of what it takes to pull print off a page, relate it to what they know, what the kids know, and be able to apply, generalize, summarize, predict, and so forth.
Right. One of the things that gets me, though, is that what we're saying, in effect, is that the majority of our children, to some degree, are having their lives all but faded by how well they learn to interface with an archaic technology.
Well, the archaic technology, if you mean by lousy teaching.
No, I mean by the code itself.
Well, I see what you mean. Well, we're not going to change the code, I'm sure.
Whoa.
Yeah.
I agree that we're not going to change the code. I've been a student of the hundreds of years
Yeah.
and many different attempts to change it.
Right.
But though we haven't been able to change it, I think that there's something to be gained by trying to understand how much of this problem is connected to the ambiguity that's pinned up in this code and where it came from.
Well, but the ambiguity, where it came from, there are scholars, as you know, that study this up the wazoo and know how the Latin and Greek influences and other influences give us what we...
collision between these two different language systems that resulted in this great ambiguity.
Right, but we can look at very transparent languages like Spanish, and you'll probably still see a very limited number of proficient kids, all things being equal, matched on background and environment and all of that. In other words, you do see similar difficulties even in transparent languages. And it is
Do you have studies on that you can send me?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. In other words...
And indexed against how much time of instruction has gone in?
Well, I don't know if we've done it that well. We would have to...
I want to say, how much does it cost us to get around the inefficiency in this code?
Well, all right. Let's take a look at the inefficiency. It is there. In other words, why do I have one tooth and several teeth, and I go into a restaurant and sit in one booth and there aren't several beef? If those are the kinds of things we're talking about. But the inconsistency is a little bit exaggerated in the sense that even within these weird words, demon words, O-U-G-H, there are clusters of small letter patterns that flow all the time.
In the conversations with Fidesky, there's no question that at a certain level of mastery and adult oversight looking down upon it, we can say, oh, it makes sense. It's not that ambiguous.
Right.
But from a child's point of view, when we're talking about, we see the letters, we're trying to create the sounds from them.
Right.
The hesitation, the slow processing that we talked about before seems to correspond to the ambiguity. Well, if you track a child's articulation as they're streaming through the reading stream, you can see the bog happen in direct correspondence to the code.
You can, absolutely. And this underscores the need for teachers to know where the ambiguities are, know the sequences that are most efficient to move kids to mastery and
parenthetically, we've developed an ambiguity map.
Yes.
You can take any language you want, show them where the maps are, and actually cue a teacher to track and anticipate where the ambiguity is going to be so that they can sync up with the child.
And if you look at the instructional programs that are most beneficial for kids at risk, that really do get swallowed up by this ambiguity, those instructional programs carry a sequence of presentation designed to move kids systematically.
But it's statistical probabilistic cannon fire. Rather than trying to get into sync with the child, bring them right to the edge of an ambiguity, so that they're actually stuttering, stumbling right there, and help them learn through it?
Well, I would say that that's something we can look at. You know,
Okay,
that's
good.
all I can say.
All right, all right. I'm not trying to advocate something in particular, but I am trying to say, because most of the parents and teachers that I talk to, when we talk about this, they're blown away that what we're basically saying is their children's lives are being fated by a technological accident of history.
Yeah, yeah. But
This is not a natural thing.
No, of course not. But no reading is natural.
Right.
Even in transparent languages, it has to be taught. And it has to be, there is a direct relationship or an inverse relationship between the amount of intensity, the amount of systematization, the amount of explicitness that goes into instruction. More of that when you have a youngster who has limited to bereft foundational building blocks.
But ultimately, the effectiveness of that is as connected to the artifacts, as connected to how well we're actually meeting the child in the edge of their ambiguity overwhelm, at the edge of ambiguity overwhelm, and helping them right there learn how to resolve that ambiguity.
Now, have you been able to talk with Louisa Moats?
She's on the list.
Yes. No. Louisa will take you through how instruction negotiates that kind of situation. In other words, when we're doing studies and we study program A versus program B, we're not studying A versus B. That's called horse race research. What we're interested in is figuring out what it is within A and B, what the interactions are that meet up with the kids' individual characteristics. Some programs present information to kids in a way where the sounds and the letters are individually given and then blended. Okay, that's called a unit of analysis. Other programs give kids bigger chunks of written language called onset rhymes rather than k-et.
Right, to create juxtapositional differentiation, right?
Well, again, just trying to figure out how different loads, different linguistic and perceptual loads interact with the kids' characteristics. Some programs move from one step systematically to another. They're prescriptive. Some programs are responsive. That is, if the teacher's good enough, they don't have to move from here to here to here. They can see exactly what
they're not overgeneralizing the blast. They're trying to get more granular in their interaction.
Yeah, well, the more granular are the more prescriptive types of things. Responsive moves, trying to keep everything in context, but being very explicit, though, being very systematic. It takes an enormously talented teacher to do that knows the answers to those 4 questions. That's when they become responsive. But all I'm saying is that what we will do is vary all of these teeny components. We'll study unit of analysis. We'll study the load, the cognitive linguistic load. We'll study the type of feedback the teacher gives. We'll study the examples from different programs. And that is how we can get to the case, number one, no one program is going to be equally effective. And why is a program not effective for certain kids? Then we can get the answers in these more granular kinds of unpackings, if you will. They want me now? Yeah. She studies. She's so anal about studying the most amazing teeny pieces of this that bears on a lot of the ambiguity issues you're talking about.
Good. I need to talk to her.
Yes.
My sense is that I mean, you're familiar with some of the attempts to fix the orthography.
Yeah.
Right? From Benjamin Franklin to the blunder of Theodore
Well,
Roosevelt.
Dick, you talk to Dick. I mean, Dick knows all this stuff. Vanesky, you know.
Right. Well, we have somewhat. Him and I agree in the fact that ultimately the ambiguity in all of this, although he wouldn't use that word variability because from his perspective it's not ambiguous, but
Yeah.
But nonetheless, that creates this opportunity for a kind of creative freedom to be more extensive,
It
more
does.
differentiated.
Well, it does.
In the way that our cognitive systems work.
It does, and it may give us even more opportunity with our language than other languages.
Exactly.
You know.
That's the point of the alphabet effect, or that whole McLuhan line as well.
Right, but the fact is, I mean, our somewhat variable orthography, inconsistent, some people would say. I think it's more regular than people think. I would agree with.
The question isn't what you and I think. It's what is it's happening to the child in terms of learning the processes.
Well, in terms of learning the processes, what we know, given the nature of our orthography, that phonology is critical. In Spanish, not so critical because it's much more transparent. So we can see the relationship between the building blocks that one needs in English to be able to negotiate our language, and the relative emphasis on, let's say, phonology rather than morphology. It's not rather than.
Because reading has to draw on it in a way rather than project it.
Well, certainly. But in order to negotiate this code, the kid has to have an exquisite understanding of sound boundaries and how to map that on top of either single letter variables or constituents, multiple constituents.
One of the things that we've done is try to map out the ambiguity. These letters they don't have definitive sound values, as you know. It's almost like it's a wave or a particle. Duality.
It is, yeah.
It can be a definitive thing.
Yeah.
It collapses like a wave.
Well, it co-articulates, yes.
It co-implicates, co-articulates in the contextual field that sometimes it's many words down the road that determine what the sound of a letter is. So that's how far ahead and how much time buffering we got to be doing in order to make this thing work.
Well, if you look at the way the system operates when we read, I don't know if you have talked with people about this, but in some ways it goes back to how we've created the shame. I don't know why education, and in particular reading within the field of education, has been so wimpy with respect to building on evidence rather than on heart. Of course, you have to have both, but the way we went down the road to whole language is really a story of stupidity. Back in the 60s.
Kindergarten Horace Mann. Don't we have to go back to
the
1970s?
That's yes. But I'm talking about in its present form.
Its latest incarnation of the battle oscillation.
Well, what I think is different about the last 30 years is we have developed a capability to study this stuff much greater than when Horace Mann or John Dewey was around. So, what happened in the 60s and 70s were great intellectual leaps in terms of oral language, that indeed oral language is natural. Listening and speaking is species universal. That's why kids in Tokyo and in Toledo know the same sounds initially. I mean,
somewhere between 1 million and 100,000 years, depending on which geneticist or anthropologist and how they crosstalk.
Right. But what's amazing is kids all over the world can handle the same consonants and vowels. If we go to Tokyo and study kids, or we go to Toledo to study kids, those kids will coo for us, they'll babble, they'll use single-word holophrastic speech, they'll use pivot open grammar. They do that in every culture, and so it's species universal. It is protoplasmically driven. All right, reading isn't. Reading, as we've talked, is unnatural, arbitrary. It's
only a few percentage of the population has only been doing it for a few hundred years.
Well, yeah. Why didn't somebody ask, if reading was natural, why do we have so many cultures with oral language that still don't have a written language?
Even people that understand this at some intellectual level, there's some kind of gut visceral level. They've common to the population, it seems, that says to itself as it looks at a child that there's something wrong with them if they can't do it. It must be implicitly held as natural.
Well, I hadn't thought about it.
It must be, but
yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It's the implicate assumption that we're all carrying around that something's wrong with these kids. It's this atmospheric pressure that's creating the context that's misinforming the teacher and the parent and shaming the child.
Okay, all right, I'll go with that. I'm getting out. You're getting places. I tend to stay with the data a little bit.
Okay.
So
I don't mean to put words in your mouth. I'm enjoying our interaction wherever it goes.
But look at this. So here we had, Chomsky and David McNeil and all the good folks at MIT and Harvard figuring out that indeed oral language is natural. It is species universal. And the educational folks came along and said, well, since reading is based on oral language, which it is to a lot of degree, it also is natural. Therefore, since we don't teach our kids directly and systematically.
Code-induced simulation of it, though.
Yeah. But, well, yeah. But what their point was is that, when kids come on the planet and we interact with them, we don't teach them, Sally, today we're going to do verbs, prepositions. You don't fragment, if you will, the content. You interact with the kids, they say things, you expand it. It occurs in a naturally nurturing kind of thing. So the leap was, well, reading is language, therefore reading is natural, therefore you do not teach the specific skills or the features. Well, I've been at the National Institutes of Health since 1991. Prior to that, I was a professor of neurology at the University of Vermont. prior to that, a professor at Northwestern University and the University of Alabama. I started out as a physiological psychologist, and I studied brain development in macaque monkeys. And my task was to try to figure out which systems in brain had something to do with the vocalizations of monkeys. And while I was doing that, two things were becoming apparent to me. Number one, Senator Proxmire had something called the Golden Fleece Award, and figuring that question out seemed close to, I was funded federally, tongue-in-cheek. It was basic research. But what I wanted to do was do research that was more applied, and I really wanted to study kids. I had my little one coming up then, and I switched from animal models to kid models because I also felt that macaque monkeys bite a lot, kids don't, but I was wrong about that. And I got some very good advice as I started that career change, and the advice was, if I'm going to study children, I need to actually go where they work and live. I need to walk alongside the kids in their job, and their job is school. And so that meant I had to learn how to be a teacher. And I went back and took education courses, and I became certified as an elementary school teacher and as a special education teacher. And I took courses, but that is not to say I learned anything. As a matter of fact, I had no idea what I was doing when I got into my third grade classroom other than calling the roll and recess. What struck me when I got in my third grade classroom was about 30% of these 9-year-olds couldn't read well at all, some not at all. I couldn't understand that because reading to me was not laborious in my being able to read, and I took it for granted. And I think by the end of the year, the 30% that I didn't help now had actually extended to about 40% because I screwed another 10% up. I just didn't have any idea what I was doing. No one had ever talked to me about how reading develops and what you do when kids come to it differently. I had been taught in these education courses that reading was a natural process, and that what you needed to do is provide kids or shower kids with rich, interesting literature and motivate them, and that they, in fact, would then inculcate the principles and move right along. I was taught not to deal with the specifics, with the skills, because that, in fact, would be demotivating. And I tried that, and I didn't help anybody. I figured that my problem, though, was maybe student-teacher ratio. I had about 28 kids, so the next year I went and taught kids with severe reading difficulties in a special education classroom, same kids all day, and I didn't help them either. And not only did I see that these were 11 and 12-year-olds, so I noticed a couple of things. Number one, how reading or the lack of reading development hurt them. I could see, even with the 9-year-olds, that when they were unable to read, it seemed to me even if I had a magic bullet, they didn't want to deal with it. They had already started to avoid print. And a lot of these kids would become active and look, in a sense, attentionally different, and possibly would have been diagnosed as ADD, but their attentional difficulties were just simple avoidance. They would become distractible, they would become fidgety when they had to read. The reason is they want to get out of that. So that just struck me both in my head and my heart to watch these tender kids who have to perform in the most visible academic thing called reading and not be able to do it. And so I started to ask the kids, and later I studied the kids and what they feel about that in my career. And kids look at reading as a proxy for intelligence. So when they see kids not able to read, they kind of formulate an idea that the kid's not as bright as they are or something. When they don't learn to read, obviously that internalizes. And so that really blew me away. So a bunch of things are blowing me away. Number one, I don't know what I'm doing. Number two, I need to know what I'm doing because this is much more than learning how to read. This is the development of social and emotional competencies and all kinds of things like that. And I also saw this tremendous impact on the kids' self-awareness, self-concept, and so forth and so on. So I just began to think about what I needed to do to figure this out. So 4 questions came to my mind over a period of time. First question was, how do kids learn how to read? what are the skills, the abilities that go into it? What are the environments that are most influential in helping develop those skills and abilities? What are the genetic factors that push the neurobiology that allow the skills and abilities to develop within the context of the environment? What kind of instructional interactions bolster that process or, in fact, limit the process or impede it? So that's the first thing that I needed to learn. Second thing I needed to learn was how in the world are some kids learning to read and others aren't? That is, which of these skills and abilities and environments and instructional interactions and genetics and neurobiology getting in the way? Which factors make it difficult for which kids? So that was the second question. Third question was, all of these kids that I had tried to teach and didn't do well had by 9 years of age already begun to avoid the reading process because they couldn't do it. So my third question was, how can we prevent it? How can we prevent reading failure from ever raising its ugly and deleterious face with these kids? How can we identify kids at risk before they ever get to school, figure out what to do, and bring them right up to snuff as they come into the first grade? Fourth question was, I know we weren't going to be able to do that for all kids. And the fourth question was, how do we help kids at older ages, with all the baggage they're carrying, begin to get over the hump, begin to get over the motivational humps and the reading humps, and the fact that as they get older, they're expected to read to learn, but they can't even read. And the content is coming in through print, but they don't have print. So how can that be negotiated? How can we adjudicate those complexities? So my own research program began back in the mid-'70s on the first two questions. What does it take to learn to read? What goes wrong when you don't? Some of that work was informative, much of it was not. But I began to work with other groups of scientists that were studying these same questions. And along the way, as my career moved forward, I was probably one of the few people in the country that had a specialization in neurobiology and developmental neuroscience and in education, if I can call the latter a specialization. My boss here at NICHD, at the NIH, Dr. Dwayne Alexander, a pediatrician who is committed and passionate about children's learning. He knows about children's health, but he also knows about their cognitive, social, emotional, and academic development, and found that we had huge gaps in our knowledge base. So he asked me in the mid-'80s to begin to work with his staff here, I was in Vermont, to construct initiatives to close the gaps between what we know about those four questions. What does it take to learn to read? What goes wrong when you don't? How do you prevent it? How do you remediate it? And what we don't know. How do we fill in the informational lacuna such that we can actually move science to human beings, science to policy, science to practice? And in 1991, he recruited me here to formulate and direct a program that would do that with significant intensity. So for the past many years, what we have built is a research network composed of 44 sites in North America, Europe, and Asia. All of the sites go after these four questions because we need to replicate. Science, as you know, builds. And when you are doing science in very complex situations, social and behavioral science, not petri dishes, no one study will ever illuminate fully what we're trying to understand. So you have to have multiple converging studies with converging evidence bearing on these questions so that we can trust the outcomes. It's a long process. It takes tremendous amounts of money. It takes tremendous amounts of talent, and so on. So we have at each of these sites multidisciplinary teams. What I mean by that is there's no way to answer those four questions unless you have neurologists on board, pediatricians on board, neuroscientists on board, educators on board, cognitive neuroscientists on board, and so forth and so on. So all of the teams at the sites are going after these four questions, so they're replicating each other, but then they also extend at their own sites their own particular looks at specific problems they're interested in. What that has allowed us to do over the years is develop a body of information now that does in fact address those four questions sufficient enough that we can now inform practice and policy. We could never have done that. What is very tough in the culture of education in this country is, in fact, once you have the evidence and you build enormous converging consensus on those 4 questions, how you get it into the educational arena. My toughest challenge is not so much the science anymore. The toughest challenge we have is in moving the science to the development of teachers in their preparation, such that what they learn is actually objective, is based upon converging evidence rather than philosophies, belief systems, appeals to authority. Getting the information to teachers already with kids who have been, in a sense, propagandized into these very broad and general and non-evidentiary kinds of approaches that they use in teaching reading. Absolute failures in terms of our scientific tests vis-a-vis their effectiveness. So you have this kind of problem. Teachers want to do that. When I was a teacher, I wanted to get up every morning. I wanted to make a difference in kids' lives. And when I saw I wasn't making a difference in kids' lives, that hurt the kids. But it made me feel dumb, foolish, embarrassed. Our teachers sometimes feel the same way, but they can only teach what they've been taught typically. And they come to these very complex interactions to teach reading, for example, with a very limited set of knowledge modules, if you will, a very limited set of concepts in terms of how do kids learn to read? Why is Sam having such difficulties? What do I see in preschool and kindergarten that might give me a red flag so that Sam is not hindered by all of the flotsam and jetsam that occur downstream from reading failure? So that's a very difficult thing to do. It is the resistance in the educational community, particularly at the higher education level, that is where teachers are trained, is enormous, almost unbelievable, such that you begin to wonder if you show people objective information, non-philosophically driven, that for these kids, these interactions work very productively, and where a youngster was at the 10th percentile in reading is now at the 60th percentile in reading. And you can show that time after time, but you still see substantial resistance. It begins to tell us that many of these issues are way beyond the kid issues. These are adult issues, fascinating adult issues where human beings are latching on to their beliefs, their assumptions, their egos, their careers, rather than looking very clearly at what works, what doesn't, making sure people know it works, measuring it, and getting the kids up to snuff.
Exactly where we meet. Exactly where we meet. That's the very purpose of this series, is that without a social reframing of just how important this is, and a new understanding, a new interior framework that breaks out of the oversimplified polarities of thought that have historically represented this whole space. We're going to keep this going on. In a conversation with Jim Wendorf, after he got a sense of what we were doing, he was asked by somebody else to summarize the past 10 years of brain research and what the challenge was and so forth. And then, what's the challenge for the next 10 years? And he said, well, it's exactly what you're trying to do. That we need to somehow take what we've learned, what we can see in our experiments and our research, and get that across in a way that actually shifts the way we think about this as a nation, as a country, as a people.
Absolutely. And, it's tougher than we ever thought, than I ever thought. And we're in fact trying to study the factors that maintain these kinds of dichotomous thinking, where people polarize phonics whole language, qualitative versus quantitative research, where people with little kids will grasp onto social emotional development versus cognitive development, which is a fascinating dichotomy for this reason. If you're going to be editing this, so we can,
Sure, yeah, please.
when I talk to the president about reading, he is fascinated in himself about why is it that we have a great deal of information that isn't traveling, particularly when human life is at stake. He views education as not just education, but as public health, and it indeed is.
National security.
Absolutely. And one of the amazing things you see that sits below these dichotomies. One question is, why do people dichotomize phonics and whole language? Why do they look at qualitative versus quantitative methodologies? Why do they look at cognitive versus social and emotional development? The common theme is a lack of knowledge. What pervades those dichotomies is a lack of understanding that goes directly to how we prepare professionals in education. There is no reason why that kind of concrete thinking should exist, but it does. And it does in very surprising ways. Let me give you an example. We are working very hard from birth to 5 now to try to understand what little ones can learn, what their brain can deal with, whether or not they like to interact with numbers and letters and all kinds of cognitive things. Does that hurt them? Is that developmentally inappropriate? So we're doing a good deal of study. On the neuroscience side, we know that little ones' brains are moving much more robustly than we ever thought. As you know, at 6 months of age, every kid who's coming along okay in every culture, using every language, can receive and produce every consonant and vowel of every language, even if the language they will ultimately use doesn't contain the consonants and vowels. That's a hefty brain. We know that kids by 18 months of age will start to learn 9 new words a day, at least every day. Amazing proliferation of not only neuronal capacity, but also the behavioral stuff that the neurons push, and just amazing kinds of things. So in the early childhood community, what the argument has been for many, many years, particularly in Head Start, is that what we need to do is focus on our little ones to ensure that they are socially competent, that they know how to get along with kids, that they can attend, that so forth and so on. Well, of course you do. You've got to do that. You want the kids to feel socially competent. There's also an emphasis in emotional health. You want to make sure kids are attaching well to adults, kids are getting along with other kids, they feel good about themselves, the nurturing environment is built to do that, of course. But the weird thing has been, do not, while you're doing that, provide any kind of interaction that might look at letters or letter sounds or numbers or words and reading and so forth and so on, because that's developmentally inappropriate, and that, in fact, will push them too quickly, push this nervous system too quickly, and so on. That's absolutely not true for a number of reasons. If it is true, or if people see kids being harmed by interactions to develop numbers, letters, sounds, and all of the things we know that go into later reading, it's because it's being taught incorrectly. It's being presented to the kids in a way that may be developmentally inappropriate. You don't work with 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds the way you work with a first or second grader. And I think people have that in their mind. But here's the disconnect. This is ironic. We obviously work with a lot of colleges and universities. So we're on campuses doing a lot of the studies that we do. And one of the things some of our studies do is look at the interactions that occur between moms and dads and kids. And when you look at professors working with their kids from birth onward, they're reading to those kids from day one, typically. They not only are reading, but as they read, even at 6 months of age, they're pointing out the letters and the sounds. They're getting the kids to see the relationships between letters and sounds and vocabulary and concepts. They're extending language. They do it on the lap, they do it at bedtime, they do it around the dinner table. They have magnetic letters on the refrigerator. And what they're doing is building not only a knowledge of language and print and how all that goes together, but they're building brain. We can see kids who don't have these interactions, and they show us brain development substantially different from kids who do have these interactions. Now, what is surprising is a lot of these folks who interact with their kids in a very good nurturing environment and do a lot of good systematic teaching from birth to 5 will then go into their undergraduate and graduate courses and teach their students never to do that. Never to do it, because it's not developmentally appropriate. That's the disconnect. And the fact of the matter is, when we do our studies and we identify kids at risk for reading failure, we know that the majority of those kids who are at risk and who will hit the wall as they learn to read are kids from poverty, kids from disadvantage whose families are working too hard to interact in the ways I just described, who may themselves not read. There may not be books in the home. They may not even know they're supposed to interact with their kids that way. And we have early childhood programs where the kids go and develop good social competencies and emotional health, but the programs are bereft of any kinds of systematic interactions to do what middle and upper middle class parents do all of the time. And the social and the emotional positives that come out of that nurturing environment go straight downhill once those kids get in school and do not learn to read. So a fascinating set of disconnects that you see among an ostensible, learned, and knowledgeable professoriate. It's one of the silliest things and saddest things I have ever seen. You know, if you look at where we are today, the bottom line is for a country like America, but to be leaving behind about 38 to 40% of its youngsters in terms of not learning to read is unconscionable. What makes it equally or doubly unconscionable, is if you disaggregate those data, 70% approximately of young African American kids can't read. 70%. If you look at Hispanic kids, 65 to 70%. That means we are producing failure where it doesn't have to be. We know what we can do to help those youngsters. We know how to get to them early. We know how to identify these kids at risk at 4 and 5 years of age. We know how to bring to bear good evidence-based programs that, if applied and implemented well, move those kids all the way from the 10th percentile right up to the average range. To be concrete, we can reduce in many of our research sites, in real classrooms, in real schools, with real kids at risk, where 98% of them are free and reduced lunch, 80% are minority. That 70% of kids leaving the first grade as failing readers reduces to 2 to 6% when we do it right. And when I'm saying we do it right, that means we bring to bear what we know from those 4 questions.
A couple of points. You cover such a wide ground. There are so many places we could go. You said avoid print.
Mm-hmm.
There's an emerging emotional science connected to affects, and one of the most powerful concepts that's emerged in that I'm aware of is what's called the compass of shame, right? Or what we've called in this series relative to reading the downward spiral of shame, and that children, like all of us, we tend to move away from what brings about shame in us. So it's not moving away from print is almost a second order thing. Moving away from feeling shame, right, which is associated with trying to process this print.
Absolutely. The most visible thing our kids do throughout their early years is read. That is the most frequent and visible behavior, visible to peers as kids enter school, is reading.
Visible because there's a structure to it that we can see them seeing.
Yes, absolutely. Typically from 1st through 3rd grades, there's a lot of oral reading. There are interactions where the kids are expected to read out loud, chorally or in round robin or whatever. When kids are hesitant, disfluent, inaccurate, slow and labored in reading, that is very visible to the peers, and the peers, the other kids, again, look at reading as a proxy for intelligence. It doesn't matter if this kid is already a genius and can do algebra in the 2nd grade. Reading produces particular perceptions. Better said, lousy reading produces a perception of stupidity and dumbness to peers, and clearly to the youngster who is struggling. That is the shame. You know, it wouldn't be bad if everybody was struggling, possibly. but not everybody is. So you have very visible differences between kids who are doing well with print and youngsters who are struggling with print. They feel like they're failures. They tell us that. One of the things that is both great but also sad is that we have had the opportunity in my job, working with all of our scientists at all of our sites, to follow kids from before they enter school until, in many cases, they're now 23. And what is wonderful about that is we can walk through life with folks who are going to become very good readers. Sadly, we have to walk through life with kids, adolescents, and then adults who never learn how to read. And sadly, when we talk with these kids, adolescents, adults who have had a tough time, that shame of not learning to read is further exacerbated by the fact they can't compete occupationally and vocationally. They don't do well in school. Clearly, the adolescents are just, they show us a level of pain that the society doesn't even see, because most of society, I think, takes this for granted. But you've considered how all of this begins to build and roil up together and keep kids further behind. You know, if we just go back to the little kids we start with, now we're starting at birth, as I mentioned, and, you know, by 3 years of age, kids from poverty, disadvantage, whatever their race or ethnicity, are already 30 to 40% behind in vocabulary development. You know, where your kids and my kids are going to learn about 9 new words a day from 18 months of age onward, kids from disadvantage are going to learn about 3. Now, what happens is they're not learning or picking up the vocabulary, but they're also not getting those interactions that stimulate brain, that help kids understand that our language is composed of smaller units. And we can talk about how that is so impressive for reading development. But so you got kids coming into preschool, kindergarten, first grade, already behind the curve in vocabulary. So even if we could teach them to read print, what are they going to relate it to? The fact is, we also have these same kids having a difficult time understanding the code because they have not understood what the building blocks are. And again, we can visit that. Here they come. We can get them up to snuff with good instruction in terms of bringing print off the page, but if we don't also bolster vocabulary, comprehension, which is why we teach kids to read, continues to lag. Consider the kids that we don't get to that still are having print problems, that are labored, hesitant, inaccurate as they come up through 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 5th grade. Well, after 4th grade or during 4th grade and beyond, vocabulary now enters through print. It doesn't enter through hanging out with your friends on the corner. So now we start to get further behind in vocabulary, such that even when the kids are accommodated for, that is, books are read to them through some platform or modality and they have some accommodations, they still do not have the background knowledge that should have been fostered by reading from day one. And we have this just constant trajectory of failure with the gap widening and widening. So, you know, when we ask that first question, what does it take to learn to read? It's neat to describe how we've done the studies. There's no way you can make sense out of kids and their development unless you hang out with them and walk with them. You can't study kids on anything at one point in time and really learn anything because you don't know what happened before, you don't know what happened after, and so forth and so on. So when I was brought to NIH and we developed the research protocols, what we wanted to make sure of were the following kinds of things. If we're going to go after those 4 questions, what does it take to learn to read? What goes wrong when you don't? How do you prevent it? How do you remediate it when you can't prevent it? What's the best way to understand and capture the knowledge to allow us to do it? So what we had to do is start before the kids got to school. So we started at 5 at that time, back in '83. And the reason we started at 5 rather than at 3 or at 1 was because we didn't have good enough measures to go lower then. We do now in many ways. And we also knew we had to look at all kids, not just these kids or these kids, but populations of kids of every race, of every ethnicity, of every background, because those 4 questions apply to the whole civilization. And so we would sample large groups of kids at 5 years of age that represent, epidemiologically what you see out there in the population. And we would measure all of these kids on those things that people thought were critical for reading. There were a lot of goofy ideas, and there still are, about reading and how it develops. But scientifically, you can't argue with that. You have to measure it, compete the hypotheses, and test it. So, for example, a 5-year-old would be in our study, would be measured on language, every part of language, phonology, semantics, syntax, pragmatics. We'd look at the attention and all phases of attention, all types of memory. We'd go in the home, look at how many books are in the home, how much the parents read to the kids, how well the parents read. We look at genetic factors and family factors. We look at neurobiological factors. Well, kids are pretty well assessed in fun ways. They like it, me next kind of thing. And we do that 3 times a year for many of these measures, and we do it for at least 5 years. So the minimum amount of time a kid's going to walk with us is 5 years. The average is 9 years. And as we talked a little bit earlier, we got a lot of adults with us now. And what's amazing is how many of these folks stay with us. There's only been a 6% attrition rate in these samples. And where we start, for example, in Connecticut in 1983 with Sally and Ben Shaywitz's study, all of those kids came from the state of Connecticut. They now live in 44 different states and 6 foreign countries, and we still follow them every year. Now, when you do that, and you measure kids across all of these things that people think are critical for reading development, you get to see which ones are right and which ones are wrong. So a lot of folks thought that, reading came naturally. A lot of folks thought that reading was related to semicircular canal, vestibular system things. Some people felt that reading was really dependent upon visual perception. Some people think that it's timing and sensory processing. Some people think it's language and phonology. Well, the only way to get to that is to test all of that objectively, compete it, see which ones fall out in the mix as either good, medium, or just poor predictors of things. So, so what you got is you got all these kids coming along with us in the first 10 years where we're not doing any interventions. We're following them. 3 times a year we'll assess, and we'll see which kids at the end of 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 10th grade, whatever it may be, read well, which ones read medium, and which ones really hit the wall, because reading is continuous. And then you can back up at the end of the 1st grade, at the end of the 4th grade, at the end of the 10th grade, all the way back to kindergarten, and see what you measured that best predicts outcomes at each of these levels. Question number 3, you can't prevent if you can't identify early. Question number 2, what goes wrong when kids don't learn to read? Well, we're measuring on a continuous basis so we can see those measurements of those properties or variables or factors that are most influential in learning how to read or gets in the way of not learning how to read. So what do we know? Number 1, we know that reading is complex, and most people give it short shrift, as I did when I was a 3rd grade teacher. I just took it for granted. It's one of the most complex, unnatural, cognitive interactions that brain and environment have to coalesce together to produce. It's amazing. I mean, if you just look at it, we got an alphabet has, 26 letters. We got those 26 letters corresponding to about 40 to 44 sounds. Now, in an alphabetic language like English or German or Serbo-Croatian or whatever it may be, the job of the beginning reader is to lay sound on top of these print characters, because it's literally impossible to memorize all this stuff. So you got to ask, well, okay, what does the kid have to have? Well, when we say question number 1, what does it take to learn to read? We know that it takes initially a clear understanding that the language we hear is composed of smaller sounds. These are called phonemes, smallest unit of sound. And people say, sure, cat has 3 sounds, cat. And I can ask people all the time how many sounds they hear in big or cat, and they'll say 3, cat, big. But they don't. You don't hear 3 sounds in cat. I don't hear 3 sounds in cat. Our kids never get any practice with the sounds in cat because nature has given us an oral language that allows us to communicate rapidly, so that when I say cat, I don't say ka'ata. What the hell is a ka'ata? What I say is cat. And the minute I start to say cat, the a and the sound co-articulate or bundle together and come by the ear as one pulse of sound. Phoneme awareness is much more difficult because you don't hear the sounds. And the brain has to pull from that one verbal or acoustic bundle the three sounds, because the ear won't. The ear never hears the individual sounds unless we spell them out.
So in that sense, the whole phonemic awareness piece of this is an artifact of learning to read, not something we naturally have to develop as a process of distinction for our language.
You do not need phonemic awareness to listen and speak and hang out and talk. Why? Because I'm not spelling the words out to you. I don't say ka'ata.
And yet so much of our research seems to suggest that the lack of this is some deficit in children.
Well, it's not a deficit in children. It's only a deficit if they don't get it to learn how to read. A deficit is only a deficit if it impacts negatively on something critical that has to be developed.
So it's not a natural deficit. It's a deficit with respect to the conditioning necessary to take off in this artificial process.
Yeah, it is an artificial process. It's a random process. Why do some languages have more or less sounds than we do? Why do some languages have more or less or different characters than we do?
Back to your research studies from a few moments ago, is part of your research study to actually look at the difference in how many hours of instruction of what kind and quality is necessary to get children through the different kinds of orthographies that are out there relative to their different ambiguities?
Yeah, sure. We study several kinds of languages. We study Chinese, logographic languages, and we study Japanese, a couple of forms of Japanese. We study different alphabetic languages, some very transparent, or what we call shallow, Spanish, and so forth, where the relationship between the sound and the letter is very straightforward, versus English, where it gets a bit more complex. So yes, we do that, but all of this fits together. Phonemic awareness is absolutely critical, non-negotiable to understanding how to read, to knowing how to bring sound to print, because we have an alphabetic language, but it in no way is sufficient.
We can serve an insufficient kind of a placeholder formatting that's necessary for the
it's a building block.
It goes later.
Yeah. We have a lot of kids in our studies that can do good phonemic awareness tasks like rhyming or saying big without the b sound and stuff like that, but they still don't comprehend. So it is necessary but not sufficient. We can't find good readers that don't have it. But if you just teach phonemic awareness like educators sometimes do, they'll latch on to a magic bullet. We're not going to get anywhere. So what else does it take to learn to read? Well, it does take phonics. I'm sorry, but it takes phonics, which is the F word in today's society, at least in the education community. But phonics is nothing more than a relationship between a sound structure and a print structure. Phonics.
Which evolved 400 years ago as an attempt to compensate for the underlying mess that happened in this code.
That's correct. Yes, oh yeah. Phonics is absolutely essential, non-negotiable. You can't read English without it. But it's not sufficient. But surprisingly, a lot of people will say, well, I never learned phonics. I learned by this or this or this. Nobody ever taught me phonics, and I read okay. And we'll bring them into our laboratories, and we'll have them read a sentence and put a word in there that they have never seen before. And guess what they use? Phonics. And they use it because a lot of our kids who can learn to read under any instructional method, no matter how cockamamie, are able to do that because they have already been taught these foundational building blocks. If you'll recall, let's go back to birth to 5. When I was bringing my kids up, I read to them all the time. I read to them systematically. I pointed out letters. I pointed out sounds. I played, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo. I read Dr. Seuss. They were inundated with all of this information that tears language apart, So their brain is now deploying neurons to tear things apart.
To differentiate.
Of course, yes, to differentiate. And once they get into kindergarten and first grade, a lot of our kids have these building blocks already. We've got a lot of 5-year-olds that know all the letters of the alphabet, know quite a few of the sounds, if not all of the sounds, and are ready to go. They have the building blocks. And because they have them, and they move on under any cockamamie approach, a lot of people think it's the cockamamie approach that's teaching them to read. And that's how a lot of this philosophy and belief gets situated. The fact of the matter is, most of our kids at risk are kids that did not have these interactions, that built these fundamental, foundational linguistic building blocks. They come into kindergarten, first grade. If they then get instructional approaches that don't take advantage of what we know about the code, if they get instructional approaches that are philosophically based, holistic, and so forth, they'll never get it. Because, they're coming for clarity. And if they're expected to discover these kinds of things without all of that previous building, how are they going to do it? You know, it's like me being sat in front of a piano listening to Mozart when I never had the background, and then expected to induce these things, expected to pick this up naturally. It just doesn't happen. So, you know, you've got all of these kinds of cultural, instructional, language things moving at one time, which all can be helped and adjudicated by just knowledge. If teachers, you know, if I had my druthers, instructional methods wouldn't be the big deal out there. What would be the big deal is if teachers could ask themselves, what does it take to learn to read? It takes phonemic awareness. It takes phonics. It takes the rapid application of those print level skills to text. Fluency is called. Even when they do all of those kinds of things, phonemic awareness and phonics and fluency, if they don't have vocabulary, they won't understand what the heck they're reading. So they got to have vocabulary. We've got kids with good phonemic awareness, good phonics, good fluency, good vocabulary, still don't comprehend well. And the reason is they're not active. They don't structure their interaction with the print. They don't summarize. They don't predict, and so on.
Can we say at that point that the processing efficiency that's happening faster than thought, that's underneath, that's converting these letters into sounds, that's taking this, I scan the letter, there's this virtually heard or actually spoken stream of thought that gets popped out. It's an assembly, a construction, and that the formation of the reflexes that are underneath their volitional awareness that are generating all this, if they're formed inefficiently, they consume too much brain bandwidth and put a drag on what's possible for comprehension.
There's no doubt about it. I mean, let me just kind of rephrase what you said, I think, elegantly into just concrete terms. The longer it takes you to read something, the more memory and the more attention it's going to require. We've got kids who, on the struggling side, hesitant, mispronounce, it takes them so long to read a passage, they can't even remember what the heck they read after a sentence, much less the passage. Yes, the capacity that goes into this print level work is far too great to give room for comprehension, for relating new to known. There's no doubt about it. I was trying to point out, though, and that's the majority of our kids who have a tough time. They are slow. They are labored in their reading. They are they're hitting the wall on a lot of these print skills.
Can we say that there's almost a correspondence between this poor instruction, a poor instructional environment, a poor educational environment, because this is not a inherently, for the most part, biological deficit. It's a context of development inefficiency that's causing inefficient to non-functional internal reflexes to form that even for some that can break it, they're breaking it so slow because of the way these things form, and perhaps mixed in with shame and other conscripted things between the affect and cognitive system, that the whole thing's just not efficient enough to fly.
Absolutely. And, you know, the fact is that, how do I want to say this? I'll just be blunt. When we look at the kids that are having a tough time learning to read, and we went through the statistics, 38% nationally, disaggregate that, 70% kids from poverty and so forth, hit the wall. 95% of those kids are instructional casualties. About 5 to 6% of those kids have what we call dyslexia or learning disabilities in reading. 95% of the kids hitting the wall and learning to read are what we called NBT, never been taught. They've probably been with teachers who the heart or where the heart was in the right place. They've been with teachers who wanted the best for the kids, but they have been with teachers who cannot answer the questions. What goes into reading? What does it take? Why do some kids have difficulty? How can we identify kids early and prevent it? How can we remediate it? Again, if we could prepare our teachers to know the depth of knowledge to answer those 4 questions, those teachers, and in fact our data show that, those are the teachers that are extremely successful with the most at-risk kids. Because in all of our clinical trials, we have never found one instructional approach that's equally efficacious, beneficial for all kids with difficulties. So what that means is that the kids are going, the teacher has to say, okay, which programs have been shown to be effective? And Russ Whitehurst's shop is working hard on the What Works Clearinghouse, looking at those programs that have been evaluated through good clinical trials and randomized designs. We have to have that. And indeed, some instructional programs are much better for some kids than others, no doubt about it. But even the best will leave some behind. So the teacher has to say, okay, here's the program that I see has the most oomph behind it scientifically. I apply that to my kids. I still got 3 that aren't responding to this good program. So I have to know what it takes to learn how to read. Phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. Where is my program not meeting the kids' needs in these areas? So the teacher has to know how to assess that range of foundational building blocks, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, has to assess the program intensity and clarity in terms of teaching those for those kids, and then modify, adjust.
Personally relevant.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. It could be actually the shame issue, hitting up against motivation, making the kid avoid even with the best program. The teachers have to know all of that.
That's a higher level. I mean, once shame kicks in, it's a bandwidth consumer.
It is.
So
it is.
The moment they move into shame, there's a reduction of the processing bandwidth necessary to process.
Absolutely, yeah. And but your point about, this is what makes this so sad. And I work for a president now. Never thought I would be in a position to do that or have the honor to be able to serve a president. He knows all of this information. I don't mean to make this political. I mean, this is an individual who is married to a former teacher where a common passion is children's development and learning. And his passion very specifically is reading. It was when he was governor. That's how he brought the NIH into Texas and so forth, and it clearly is now. His statement that if we do not do well, it demonstrates the soft bigotry of low expectations comes out of the fact that he sees all of the data showing all of those kids at massive risk from disadvantaged homes when taught well, doing as well as everybody else. If you can do it there, why aren't we doing it here? And if we're not doing it here, it's because we have given in to the soft bigotry of low expectations, which has in fact concretized itself in developing professional knowledge in teachers that's limited and not evidence-based, and not implementing what we know, and not providing the robust leadership in schools to make sure teachers have the information and it's implemented well. What I'm saying is that time after time, our president, much of our leadership downtown, the Secretary of Education, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, all know these data. They all have taken very close looks at the fact that we have a national shame in terms of teaching our kids to read. They all know it doesn't have to be that way. They all know that when we do things right, based upon evidence, not philosophy, not belief, not untested assumptions, but on what continues to grind out of the scientific mill, we reduce that shame, that 70% of many kids who cannot learn to read, to about 2 to 6%.